Okay, thanks very much, and it's a real privilege to be here at the University of Tartu and in Estonia. And it's also a privilege to be able to deliver this lecture, which is in honor of a great Polish journalist and writer who burned the candle for Africa and for poor countries and for poor people at a time when most people were not really following what was happening in faraway places. The talk that I'm going to give, as the title indicates, is about the making of the Millennium Development Goals. I'm going to try and give you a brief history of the Millennium Development Goals, how they evolved, and then do a fairly quick analysis of them, and then think about what this means for the future. I've been in Estonia, I think, for about 9 hours now, so I am an instant expert, obviously. But I know very little about Estonia, but I will try to link it a little bit to perhaps some issues that are relevant to Estonia. And particularly, I think when we look at the Millennium Development Goals, we can see some links with the European project and the way in which norms can be changed within Europe by taking part in these sort of global exercises. I've got an admission to make first of all, especially as our moderator today is an expert on politics and governance, and that is that usually I work on poverty at the micro level. Sometimes microeconometrics, sometimes rural sociology, but most of my research has been talking to poor people, particularly in Bangladesh, but also in the Pacific in Papua New Guinea, where I did my PhD originally, but trying to find out from poor people what they're doing, what their strategies are, how they're trying to make their lives better, and from that trying to understand what governments and NGOs are doing. But about 3 years ago, the Leverhulme Trust gave me a chance to do something different, and I thought, well, I don't always have to be micro, let's go macro. What's the biggest thing in poverty? And the sort of biggest thing in poverty is that poverty became global poverty around about 2000. Up until the late 1990s, poverty was about local problems and national problems. But over the 1990s, in a way, this new concept was invented of global poverty. And so for the last couple of years, I've been trying to understand bits and pieces of this thing called global poverty. And the Millennium Development Goals are at the heart of this because they, in a way, tell us that we need to act globally if we are going to remove extreme poverty from around the world. But this has meant that I've moved into international relations, political economy, and subjects which I'm no expert on. But I've done that before and got away with it, so we'll see whether I can get away with it this time. Let's move on to the MDGs. I might have asked you if any of you, or how many of you have heard of them, and I could, if we had a little bit more time, sometimes choose a victim and see if someone who's put their hand up actually does know the Millennium Development Goals. When you do that, then you generally find that for people who work on international development, poverty reduction, then they'll know them, but anybody outside of that small subset of people might have heard of something. They probably can't remember that they're called the Millennium Development Goals. But here, I think you can see them here. Some of the slides may actually be a bit too small. But here are the Millennium Development Goals. Basically, I see this as the world's biggest promise. It's a global agreement to reduce poverty and human deprivation at historically unprecedented rates through collaborative, multilateral action by governments, and then sucking civil society and sucking in the private sector. There have been lots of big global promises, but I think this differs from the others because it's a really comprehensive understanding of poverty that is put in here. It defines that we have to have systematic efforts to reduce poverty. It actually includes mechanisms for increasing the financing of poverty reduction, mechanisms for implementing poverty reduction policies and programs around the world, for monitoring them, and it also includes advocacy exercises for that. So these are the Millennium Development Goals. At their heart, and I'll talk about this in a second, is the idea of human development, that poverty reduction is about raising human capabilities. It's about educating people, about empowering people, about ensuring that people are healthy, ensuring that they are not hungry. It also includes, right at the head, eradicating extreme poverty. It includes an income poverty goal, so it includes economic development. It believes that we've got to get incomes up for poor people, as well as education, as well as health levels. And in Goal 7, it includes ensuring environmental sustainability, that we've got to make sure that we achieve poverty reduction without destroying the world. And finally, it talks about a global partnership. And the global partnership is particularly about what the rich world and what rich people should be doing to support people who haven't got control of resources, haven't got access to the things that they need so much. You can find these on the UNDP website, on the UN website, on the World Bank website if you want to look at them. But I'll also talk a little bit about results-based management. These are packaged in a particular way. They're packaged with the idea that if you set concrete goals, then that you can change the behaviors of organizations and people so that they will achieve those goals. And there are the 8 goals, but there are then 21 targets. So each goal has a set of targets, and then for each of the targets there are numerous indicators which are monitored every year. There are now 60 indicators. So it's actually a particular format in which these are presented. I'm particularly interested today in looking at these, not so much in terms of this targeting, whether they have managed to lead to better policies and plans. I'll talk a little bit about this. But I think we have to understand these in a way as an idea. And ideas are usually very important to universities, and ideas should matter at universities. And I think if we're to judge these and understand them, then we have to see them as not the first, but as a recent major attempt to actually change the way that people think, and that these are part of an historical exercise that started many years ago and will continue hopefully into the future, which is basically to promote the norm internationally that extreme poverty is morally unacceptable in an affluent world. So I see these, they can be a planning tool and a monitoring tool, but I see them as an idea which is trying to change the way people think. Let's just give you a little bit of a prologue. I've already talked about them being the world's biggest promise. I think it'll become clear as I talk, but in some ways they are the result of a sort of fragmented conversation between this idea of human development, which has developed out of the work of Amartya Sen and other people I'll refer to, and the neoliberal ideas which had driven development around the world in the 1980s and into the 1990s. And the Millennium Development Goals are a sort of compromise between these. The human development, in a way, school that didn't like neoliberal economics hasn't managed to push neoliberal economics aside, but neoliberal economics has had to accommodate itself and make some compromises. They evolved at a particular historical moment, and I think it's very important that we recognize that. They evolved when, in a way, the neoliberal vision of development and of neoliberalism leading to economic growth everywhere, leading to poverty reduction everywhere, they arrived at a time when that was clearly faltering. It wasn't working. Many examples of that in Africa, but I think probably sitting in Estonia, we can look what happened very rapidly when Russia economically liberalized very rapidly, and we had the collapse in the economy, but also the collapse in life expectancy, educational services and other things. So it was a moment when this neoliberal idea was being challenged, but also they arrived at a time at the turn of the millennium in the year 2000 when the pressure was on world leaders, and particularly the leaders of rich countries, to explain to their citizens and to the world how this third millennium would be different, would be better, how this millennium would have some different, some more human vision of what was to be achieved, that we could turn the page on incidents like World War II and World War I and many of the other problems that we'd faced in the 20th century, that this century and this millennium would be a different era for humanity. If you've got the paper, I briefly explain the sort of framework that I'll use later on, but for those of you who are political sciences, I'm using Robert Cox's ideas, looking at material capabilities. That's the capacity that countries and organizations have to get control of natural resources and transform them into things that people want or need through technology and through organizational capacities. I'll also be looking at ideas, at the concepts and the narratives that are used to analyze and explain what's happening and explain how things could be different. And we'll also look at institutions, forms of association, sometimes formal organizations, sometimes informal forms of organizations like civil society groups, like social movements. Let's get quickly to the history then. I'll definitely try and do this quickly because I've found this history rather fascinating, but if I make it too fascinating for me, it might be boring for you and it won't give us time for analysing it. So you're going to get a brief history of the Millennium Development Goals. The first thing to note about these Millennium Development Goals is this wasn't the first time that there'd been big promises. There were antecedents. The most obvious is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. That declared that we should have a world in which there should be freedom from want, that nobody should want for their basic needs in terms of food, in terms of education, in terms of health services. That declared that this was a universal right. And so that was one way, in a very sort of constitutional, a very international legal attempt to try and say that poverty should not be allowed to exist. Later on, there was the development decade of the 1960s, when the 1960s were declared the decade of development, essentially with the target that there should be economic growth in all poor countries, that all of the rich countries of the world should give 1% of their GDP for international development in Africa, Asia and Latin America, and by that device that poverty should be reduced. Interestingly, the development decade was spearheaded by Kennedy, spearheaded by the USA. But after that, it really only got going for 1 year, and then the USA's interest waned, and much of the world's interest waned. In the 1970s, I've put down this NIEO. I'm probably using, for those of you who don't work on development, one of the things we always have is lots of these acronyms. But the NIEO is the New International Economic Order. And this was an idea that was popular in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and promoted by African and Asian countries. Pretty logical idea. It said the present economic order is extremely unfair. It doesn't pay poor countries what their products are worth. It doesn't allow them to trade fairly. It doesn't allow them to influence global policies at all. And so they promoted this idea of a major political change, a new international economic order. As with many other ideas, that faded because the rich countries didn't seem to find it very attractive, this idea of having a new international economic order. In the 1980s, things went really quiet on this idea of poverty reduction in foreign places, in poor countries. Thatcher and Reagan didn't find this was an attractive idea. It wasn't a priority. If we just liberalised, if we just got the prices right, then wealth would spread around the world. Everyone would be okay. But in 1990, as these neoliberal ideas were certainly beginning to show that they were not achieving what they were promising to achieve, growth in Africa and Asia, at the rates that might have been expected, then a number of things happened. For the Millennium Development Goals, particularly important was what's called the Child Summit, a meeting convened by UNICEF in New York, which looked at the condition of the world's children, flew in a large number of international leaders. It didn't actually fly them in, it got them to stay on for a weekend. They were already at the UN General Assembly and they agreed to stay on for a weekend. But around 60 of these national leaders, many of them from large, rich countries, said that meeting children's needs was a global priority. We had to get immunization out, we had to reduce child mortality. And this Child Summit was very important because it made some promises, but almost immediately afterwards, they were implemented. The leader of UNICEF, Jim Grant, went round the world and met with presidents and prime ministers and said, "What are you doing? Show me how your budget has changed for children. Show me what's changed about the programs. Show me what's happening with the immunization rate." And this actually moved things along. And that was very important because it showed that, in a way, international meetings, and particularly summits of national leaders, could lead to changed budgets and changed behaviours and actions on the ground. 1990 was also important because it was the year when the World Development Report, produced by the World Bank, looked at poverty and agreed that it simply wasn't an economic issue. It took a step forward and said, no, you've got to have education, you've got to have some social services. Economics alone will not solve poverty. And it was also when the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, launched the Human Development Report. And that was a very important document, which is still published every year by the UN, which pushes this idea of human development, that international development, national development, is not simply about a growing economy. it's about feeding people, it's about immunizing children, it's about educating everybody. But let's go back. This Child Summit really kicked things off, and we then had a series of major UN summits. The Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, Human Rights in Vienna in 1993, the International Conference on Population and Development in 1994 in Egypt, which pushed the idea of reproductive and sexual rights. Rather than simply the idea of keeping fertility low, it actually said, no, this is an issue of rights and individuals. It's not about countries driving down their fertility rate. It's about individuals having the choices they want, and particularly women, not just men, having the choices they want about reproduction. There was the Social Summit in Copenhagen in 1995, very important, because it's at that stage when talk about development begins to shift from using this term development and international development to talking about poverty reduction. And it's in 1995 at the summit in Copenhagen when world leaders begin to talk about poverty reduction as the primary goals of development activities. So we get a whole set of summits in the early 1990s, and at the end of each of these summits you get promises about what's going to be done. Some of them, as I said, with the Child Summit, really lead to changes on the ground. Some of them, like the Earth Summit in Rio, lead to the Kyoto Protocol, but implementation of that has been somewhat slow, as we can see from what's happening in present-day negotiations. Around 95, 96, we get some changes, and actually the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD suddenly gets in control of the international agenda. Now, the OECD, of course, is the club of the world's richest countries. Usually they've got to be democracies as part of that. And the DAC is the club of aid agencies from all of those countries. It's where the ministers of international development, international cooperation come together, and also where the heads of the bureaucracies concerned come together. They were in a terrible stage in 1995-96. In 1990, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain, we'd had this promise that defense expenditures would reduce and there would be more resources to make the world a better place. But actually what happened was foreign aid went down every year after 1990, and the rich world showed less and less interest in what was happening in poor Africa and poor Asia and poor Latin America. And so the people who were running these ministries and running these organizations were pretty depressed. They weren't focused on international development. I've interviewed a lot of them. They said, we were focused on downsizing our staff. That was the main issue. Who do we sack this week? Not how do we solve poverty in Africa? And so they were looking for an idea. And they kept trying this. But in 1996, they came up with this very simple idea of having a report that would be about development that they tried to sell to the citizens of rich countries. And they came up with this little list of 6 international development goals taken from the summits. And these goals were very similar to the Millennium Development Goals, but they did not include partnership. The goals that the rich countries wrote down that they took from the UN conferences said what must be achieved in poor countries, but it didn't say what rich countries would do. They very carefully left out committing themselves to anything. This list was agreed, and in 96, 97, 98, some European countries took this very seriously. We had a new minister called Claire Short then, who actually rammed these international development goals down the throats of her cabinet members, down the throats of the members of parliament. We could go into our supermarkets and you've got a little piece of paper with these international development goals on the checkout stand. We will reduce child mortality. We will do this. And she really popularised it. That certainly helped to change public attitudes, change our ideas in the UK. She actually, I mustn't get into too much detail, she managed to form a group called the Utstein Group, but there were 4 women ministers, all centre-left at that time, all very powerful personalities. The 4 of them formed an informal group called the Utstein Group, and they terrorised the men who ran international development. They weren't part of the club. They didn't behave in the socialised way. They would look at these lists and say, no, you're lying. We've agreed this. You're not doing it. And people didn't do that. But these 4 powerful ministers really upset the game. Internationally, at the UN, in the European Union, they didn't behave the way the men who'd control this area had done. And so that advanced things in some countries. I mean, the other members were in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Norway, and Norway and the Netherlands were already, in a way, like-minded. 1998, things go back to the United Nations, because the United Nations, Kofi Annan's just come in. You've got to have a big meeting. You've got to have a big party when the Millennium comes. And so what are we going to do? What do we do in 2000 was a big question. What's happening as we move in 98, 99 to 2000 is actually we find the world's in this twin-track process. No one is control. No one's actually got this vision of the Millennium Development Goals at that stage. Everybody's talking about goals, but they're not quite sure what it's moving towards. We have the United Nations with the General Assembly. Kofi Annan produces a document called We the People. It's about 80 pages with many goals and many things that are to be achieved. Quite vague. At the same time, the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank and the UN, including Kofi Annan, they produce another vision which is called 2000, A Better World for All. And this is essentially the International Development Goals, which the rich countries have produced. So essentially you've got two processes. One is a list of things that the rich countries of the world think should be the goals. The other one is what the UN General Assembly, the 189 members of the UN General Assembly, think should be a goal. In September 2000, we get agreement at the Millennium Summit. 189 countries, 149 heads of state or heads of government come together and they say, we agree to this Millennium Declaration, and a major part of the Millennium Declaration is that poverty will be eradicated across the world and setting goals for ensuring that that is at least 50% achieved by 2015. But we've actually still got these two lists, and I won't go into detail, but a whole series of politics eventually produces the Millennium Development Goals, but very, very hidden, very secretive politics. Essentially, the way the Millennium Development Goals turn out is that they're like the OECD's, like the rich countries' international development goals, but on the bottom we get Goal 8, because the poor countries, and particularly powerful countries like India, say, we won't sign up to a list which hasn't got something down about what the rich countries are going to do. And so Goal 8, if you look at it in detail, talks about having a fairer trade regime for international trade, tackling climate change, looking at intellectual property rights so that poor countries don't have to pay excessive amounts. And it's a set of things that the rich world says it will do. It's not actually formally approved. The Millennium Development Goals are not formally approved at the UN General Assembly, but in 2002, all the world leaders turn up at Monterey and they agree that they're going to put more finance into development and that what development means is achieving the Millennium Development Goals. And so we really seem to have momentum now. We have the goals and we have a set of promises from rich countries that they will put more money into global poverty reduction, and from poorer countries that they will focus their national policies more on poverty reduction and that they will reduce corruption. And so we have this Monterey Consensus. Unfortunately, 2002, as I see it, is the peak. It doesn't mean it's the global peak forever, but since 2002, international interest in the Millennium Development Goals, international interest in financing the Millennium Development Goals, in committing to them, has gone down. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. In 2005, we have what's called the Millennium Summit +5. And +5, when you work at the United Nations, means you have to look at what you agreed 5 years ago and say what you've achieved. And the Millennium Summit +5 was a very confused event. Confused for a number of reasons. Firstly, because John Bolton, the UN ambassador to the United Nations, 1 week before we're about to say what's happening, he looks at the agreement which most countries have agreed on, and he makes 700 amendments to it. Most of them striking out the word poverty and striking out the word Millennium Development Goals. And he gives a very clear signal that in 2005, poverty reduction is not what the US is interested in. The meeting opens up and people are confused, and then Hurricane Katrina hits. And George Bush is pretty embarrassed because here in the world's most affluent nation, you can see the military on the street protecting property whilst people in wheelchairs are dying for want of food and water just outside, beside these things. And it's treated as you look at it, in a way property was protected, but the people of New Orleans were not protected from the storm. And so, towards the end of this summit, actually George Bush says he's for the Millennium Development Goals, and he has a change of heart, but he clearly feels that he needs to rehabilitate his global image, and that having failed to meet the needs of the people of New Orleans, he at least needs to say he's going to meet the needs of the poor of the world. So in 2005, he actually commits himself, at least verbally, to this. But then not much happens afterwards. At this time, aid is rising, but that's because of debt forgiveness. But debt forgiveness isn't really increasing your aid budget, because you weren't going to get paid back anyway. So it's only a one-off paper transaction. It's not putting real resources into poverty reduction. In 2008, Gordon Brown, our Prime Minister, I don't know whether you know, he's got problems in the UK now. If you look at the UK news, he had problems back in 2008 too. He's never really been popular, but he put a lot of time and effort, had a Cabinet Office unit and a unit in our Department for International Development working on having a high-level event at the UN General Assembly in 2008 to say, what the hell is happening with the Millennium Development Goals? He managed to get that question on the agenda, he managed to have some discussions, but he didn't manage to really raise their profile, which was what he was desperately trying to do. Let's move on to understanding the MDGs then. Our colleague, our moderator here, if I get talking too fast, please do. I am watching the time, but slow me down if I get too excited. Let's put it into an analytical framework. Basically asking three questions. Why does the world have the MDGs? The official story is because every country in the world, and this includes Estonia, because you've signed the documents, your Prime Minister has put his hand up several times, your various Prime Ministers have agreed to this. So, you know, whether you like it or not, you're signed up to it. In fact, I wonder why you don't ask your Prime Minister and leaders more often what they're doing for the Millennium Development Goals. I'm sure you do, but we'll talk about that later. So why do we have them? But the official answer, which is that we're all concerned, needs to be unpicked, because essentially most people don't care and most countries don't care. And one of the reasons why I keep talking about this is because I'm trying to get people to care. The second one is, why have they had less influence on global decisions and on action than many of the people who devoted years of their lives to achieving them? Why haven't they had the impact? And the third one then is to ask, what are the implications? What does this mean about what we do in 2010, in 2015, in 2020? And I'll look at these things of material capabilities, ideas and norms, and institutions as I do this. So material capabilities. This, in a way, is about economics. It's about getting hold of natural resources and transforming them through technology and organization into things that people want, which may be food, it may be cars, it may be houses, it may be access to the internet. And we have to understand that at the heart of the MDGs is this idea of material capabilities. Essentially what the MDGs say is that we now have the material capabilities. We have the natural resources, we have the technology, we have the organizational power. This is humanity at a global level. We just need to change some of the elements of what we're doing, improve access for poorer people and poorer nations, get technology to people who haven't got technology, share organizational capacities, and there needs to be no need for extreme poverty. There'd still be inequality, there'd still be people who are not well off, but that we have these material capabilities at least to make sure that nobody lives on $1 or $2 a day, that no child goes without immunization, that nobody has to drink polluted and contaminated water, and goals of that sort. And that's the sort of thing which Jeffrey Sachs, probably the leading academic in looking at the Millennium Development Goals and global poverty, that's what he's argued. We have the material capabilities, we just need to shift 0.5% or 1% of global GDP, and nobody needs to be poor. But when we look at this, we find that the main units that would have to rewrite the rules of the game, that would have to change the way in which these resources are accessed, in which technology is accessed, to share their organizational capacities, these are the rich states of the world who tend to have the material capabilities. Then they really don't see very much material interest for themselves. They are thinking largely in terms of their own wants, own needs, perhaps, as their citizens might express it, and so they have not been prepared to change access to natural resources, to share technologies, to develop organizational capacities around the world. And one could certainly say that this whole MDG project, or if we see it as a longer-term project, this whole project of global poverty reduction has lacked political leadership. The big countries, the powerful countries are prepared to say, we're behind this, but then they jet out of New York and things only change a little bit or very little. The USA is the obvious culprit to look at. You've got to be careful with the USA, partly because George Bush managed to damage its image so much that certainly in the UK I only need to say USA, and all my students, if I say something bad about the USA, then students are really supportive of it. But we need to be careful about that, because the USA may be the villain at times, but we do also need the resources, the technology, and the capacities of the USA. A world without the USA would be quite difficult to imagine global poverty reduction in. But the USA has been ambivalent. Under Bush it was ambivalent because, both in terms of the political constituencies that supported Bush, in terms of the way he and his advisors believed the world worked, the sort of neoconservative philosophy. They didn't see this as an issue that should be a priority, and they didn't see it as an issue that the US could have much effect or influence over. So they've been ambivalent about it. The EU, and hopefully colleagues from the EU will correct me on this, because I know relatively little about the EU. I spend most of my time in Asia and Africa. But the EU, as I'd see, has had no clear position. It's got really committed members. If we look at the Netherlands, the Swedes, Denmark maybe until recently, and recently certainly the UK, then there are countries that are really batting for global poverty reduction, MDG implementation, thinking about steadily increasing aid over the years. But we've also got a number of countries that are extremely ambivalent or see very little interest in the idea of global poverty reduction. Maybe it's not their problem. Maybe they say, we've got so many problems at home, we can't worry about other people's problems. But the EU, in a way, is ambivalent about it. But I would propose that the EU actually has been changed by the MDGs, and that the MDGs are a sort of a nascent, a starting international norm in the EU, which says that all the countries of the EU, all the citizens of the EU should be thinking at some time, just a little bit, about global poverty reduction and about international development. Now, I say that because for new members of the EU like Estonia, all of your governments had to sign up to having a foreign aid budget, to setting up institutions for international development. They had to make promises about raising public awareness about international development and the MDGs. But one of the prices of joining the EU club was that you had to say, we have a role to play in reducing poverty in poorer parts of the world for poorer people. And so I think the EU is one part of the world where one could say there is a regional norm. We haven't got a global norm for poverty reduction yet, but in the EU there is the start of the possibility, and I think the Millennium Development Goals have been very a powerful part of that. They've been, in a way, one of the tools, one of the instruments that has made that possible. Moving on to a few other countries on this material capabilities front, obviously the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India and China are becoming increasingly important in terms of their material capabilities. They've got very different ideas. India's mildly antagonistic to the Millennium Development Goals. That's because India says, we have national goals, we have a 5-year plan. Don't you rich countries tell us what you think our goals should be on immunisation, on child mortality, on maternal mortality. We're really worried about those, and we'll set our own goals. So India, in a way, sees this as rich countries trying to interfere. China has little interest. I've talked to a few Chinese bureaucrats, and they say, oh, we will achieve them, and we'll do nice documents for the UN to show that we've achieved them and show that we're taking concern, but it's not showing any leadership. Russia is really interesting. It's basically no comments. When I talk to Russian students at the University of Manchester, they sort of say, well, no, David, you're sort of so far off the radar. Nobody knows people like you exist in Russia. Maybe we need an EU mission to Russia to get universities talking about those things. Developing countries, particularly the G77, which is the club of 130 low-income and middle-income countries at the United Nations. Originally it had 77 members, now it's got 130. They're more interested in national poverty reduction strategies, because that's when they have to negotiate with the International Monetary Fund. That's when they have to negotiate with the World Bank on how much they can spend on public expenditure, how much they can spend on health and education. So they nod their heads. They hope to get more aid through the Millennium Development Goals, but they're focused much more on poverty reduction strategies. The G7, G8 keeps putting Africa and African poverty on its agenda and has occasionally looked at global poverty. But every time this happens, it's got other worries. At the moment, it's worried about global financial stability. Trade is also an issue. Conflict, the war on terror dominated from 2001 till now. Energy security, climate change. The G7, G8 is presently morphing. It's changing into the G20, and it's welcoming some of the larger middle-income countries, an Islamic country, and becoming much more diverse. Rather than being about 15% of the world's population, it's now going to be about 65% of the world's population, the countries coming to it. But it doesn't look as though the G20 is going to take more of a focus on global poverty or the Millennium Development Goals at the moment. The G0.7%, as they call themselves, the countries that have already met international aid targets, Denmark, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and now the UK, they do their best. But really, the UK is in the strongest position because its economy is bigger than these other economies. It has a special relationship, apparently, with the USA. Certainly has a special relationship with the EU, as we still try and work out our relationship with the EU. But in a way, none of these countries that have committed themselves to the MDGs have had the leverage to change what happens in the G7, G8 or the G20. The UK continues to be the self-appointed leader of the pack on global poverty reduction. It's Gordon Brown, before him Claire Short with Tony Blair, who used to say at G7, G8 meetings at the UN, we must put the MDGs on the agenda. But politically, it's really interesting the way that, in a way, the UK and USA, we managed to go in Iraq together. But when we look at global poverty, then we are 180 degrees apart in terms of the significance we give it. So we can do some foreign policy things together, but on the Millennium Development Goals, then we don't appear to have managed to get any leverage over the USA. And there's corporations and businesses are obviously the main sort of drivers within this material capabilities. They are giving a little bit more to charity, but that's probably slowing down now. They're talking about corporate social responsibility. Some of them are taking it seriously. My own institute is having great success with Cadbury's, the chocolate manufacturers. They're really taking the condition of their labour extremely seriously. And we get lots of pious words. Quickly then, moving on to ideas, aware that time is moving on. Hundreds, thousands of ideas were contested to get into the Millennium Development Goals. $1-a-day poverty. I haven't got time to talk about it, but $1 is the most amazing concept. I mean, we estimate it. These estimates are sort of a crazy act of the imagination, but really it's amazing how economists have managed to improve those estimates. They say 1.6, 1.7 billion, but they were $500 million out 5 or 6 years ago. So these things are very important, but within income poverty, gender, reproductive health, all of these many different ideas were being pushed into the Millennium Development Goals. The two that I've mentioned early on that are important, one is human development. And human development was pushed in, and it managed to challenge these neoliberal ideas about growth is enough. It didn't manage to push those neoliberal ideas and purely growth and economic-oriented ideas out of the way. And maybe that's a good thing, because reducing poverty without growth is extremely difficult. But they managed to achieve a compromise in which the Millennium Development Goals have income poverty reduction and then have human development within them. The big thing to note is that this compromise left human rights out. Human rights is sort of in the small print in the Millennium Development Goals. Human rights, the Universal Declaration are important, but the goals are what are to be achieved. The other, in a way, contest or debate was between how you frame these goals. Previously, the goals had often been framed as human rights, particularly going back to 1948, the right to a life without needing very basic needs. Results-based management, an idea that comes out of business schools, out of management institutes, dominates the Millennium Development Goals. And these were introduced by the rich countries through the OECD. They didn't trust developing countries. They wanted things to be spelled out so that you could say, what is this country achieving? Is it achieving these targets? And human rights and human rights activists feel they were pushed aside by this results-based management format, which has annual monitoring of performance. It doesn't look at whether you're honouring human rights, this monitoring process. It says, are you improving in terms of these indicators? Now, key thing to note, an interaction between material capabilities, particularly the power of rich states, and ideas, is that goals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of the Millennium Development Goals have very tight targets
and dates set for them. Goal 8, which is about what rich countries will do, about international trade, about foreign aid, about climate change, about intellectual property rights, doesn't have these results-based management targets. The people who insisted that global goals had to be results-based management oriented stepped back when it came to the goals that were about them. They were prepared to say what the goals were, but not to put measures on them and not to put dates on them, showing us the way in which political power and military power is still able to operate. The rich countries have moved and have made the promises, but they're not going to be nailed down to concrete dates. Having said that, some countries within the EU have set their own national dates for some of these things. Certainly the UK set a date for when it would reach 0.7% aid. So although the global agreement may not have got the targets down, some countries have moved forward. The final two things there, I'll answer those in questions. Reproductive health, gender equality, very important, not treated well in the Millennium Development Goals. Moving on to institutions. The 1990s and early 2000s, thousands, tens of thousands of institutions devoted enormous amount of time to this setting of goals and the Millennium Development Goals. I was working very closely with Save the Children from then. In 1996, they decided they had to get out of this goal-setting exercise because it was just taking all of their policy time over. It was just taking the whole organization over, engaging with the United Nations. They had to retreat from it, but lots of organizations. The UN agencies, very important. They had the meetings that set goals for children, for sustainability, for poverty reduction. The DAC, this club of aid agencies, very important. They brought up the list. They, in a way, promoted this idea of poverty reduction as a global goal, but they gave it a format which was very much in the image of what they wanted, very much about what was to be achieved in developing countries. The UN General Assembly, its main role was agreeing the MDGs belatedly, but it also added Goal 8, because the G77, the poor countries, particularly India, were not going to sign up to an agreement which didn't include what rich countries would do. The UN Secretariat guided the process. UNDP, very important in terms of promoting the idea of human development. After the Millennium Development Goals were agreed, it set up the Millennium Project to have a global plan to be implemented to reduce poverty. High modernism. This believed that you could plan poverty reduction with one plan around the world. At the other extreme, it had the Millennium Campaign, which said, no, we need to get all the citizens of the world, rich and poor countries, to know about it. The IMF, a really interesting role. I've done some interviews there. It signed up to the Millennium Development Goals, but when I interviewed the chief economist for Africa, he said, we don't do European social policy. And the Millennium Development Goals are European social policy. So they sign up to these things, but they're absolutely uncommitted. Another staff member told me, I've been told to mention them in the introduction to agreements. But then you don't let them influence. They mustn't influence the agreement. You mustn't let ideas about immunization or child mortality change the economic variables that you're checking. And that World Bank, a variety of things there. DFID has done well in my own ministry. Women's movements and environmental movements have been very important on this, but they've been blocked by the Catholic Church. The Holy See managed to stop reproductive health from making the list in 2000. It came in 2005. NGOs also very important at times, particularly ones like the International Women's Health Coalition, which managed to set up an epistemic community, a group of globally connected intellectuals and doctors and practitioners committed to reproductive health. Quickly on then to the conclusions. Why do we have the MDGs? Well, this was an unplanned process. It evolved out of an incredible, complex set of political interactions. It reflects compassion. Many people involved in these were trying to make the world a better place, believed that there was an ethical requirement to reduce poverty and reduce extreme poverty, but also lots of self-interest. Many people talking them forward. It was good for their career, good for their organization, good for their national image. We also had that Millennium moment. In 2000, to maintain the legitimacy of the UN, to maintain the legitimacy of the rich countries, there had to be a vision of how the world would be better. What have they achieved? You'll find masses of reports on the UN website, on the World Bank website, but we don't really know. Things have been improving at different rates, improving reasonably in East Asia and South Asia, not improving anything like as quickly in Africa, but Africa is a mosaic. It's not all bad news. There's good news and there's bad news there. But we don't know whether the Millennium Development Goals have contributed to that or whether it's other forces. They certainly helped to stall the decrease in aid. Once the Millennium Development Goals were agreed, then aid did rise for 3 or 4 years before it's tailed off in the last few years. Not dramatic changes, but even if you increase by a few $1 billion the amount of aid, that does lead to more immunised children, additional places at schools, more retrovirals for AIDS sufferers. So that is an achievement. And I think it has advanced the idea of ending extreme poverty as a norm, particularly in the case of the UK. I think in the UK, even our Conservative Party, which used to be our anti-foreign aid party, is now committed to foreign aid, it tells us, although it's a little bit wobbly. Now we've got so much national debt, but it's still saying it's committed, which is unbelievable compared to 10 years ago. And in the EU, then I'd say we've got this very nascent idea coming through. In the USA, you find that there's a really strong movement, the Micah Challenge. A lot of conservative Christians are really getting involved with this, signing pledges saying 0.7% of their income is to be given to charity for foreign aid and telling everybody else they've got to do this. 150 million people will stand up. And it stood up last year on October the 17th on International Poverty Day to say, end poverty. I'll be interested to hear whether there's been any impact in Estonia. Why haven't they been implemented? Well, I've talked through this quickly. Because those who have material capabilities, those who control the world's resources, the countries, the organisations, don't really find that global poverty reduction is a priority for them. If you get cynical, my students and my radical students tell me it's a successful false promise. It allowed the rich world and the leaders of the rich world to look good in 2000. It allowed them to stand up there and say the world would be better, and it cost them next to nothing, and now they've backed off it. I'm not quite sure whether I'm that cynical, but maybe you'll persuade me. Ideas have been incredibly important in this. The Millennium Development Goals, and particularly the idea of human development, has changed these things, and it's one of the reasons why I work at universities. In a way, creating these ideas, trading these ideas, pushing these ideas is important, and I think human development has advanced things and is helping to develop this international social norm of ending poverty around the world. Institutions have been heavily involved, but I think there are two disappointments with this. It's proved impossible to get a social movement for global poverty reduction. It just doesn't work. You can have a campaign, you can't get a social movement, and we haven't managed to get an epistemic community. There's still an epistemic community of neoliberal economists at the World Bank, at the IMF, in treasuries and finance ministries around the world. We haven't really managed to create an epistemic community that can challenge them effectively. The people who control public finances are still taking the same sorts of decisions informed by the same ideas. Should we abandon the MDGs? No, I don't think so. I think that would be bad because that would suggest that multilateral institutions and international agreements can never work. The MDGs have taken things forward, but only a tiny step forward. So what should we do? I think we need, in a way, to continue to promote and even take greater efforts to promote the MDGs as an international norm. And we've got to see this in a longer-term perspective, like the abolition of slavery, like votes for women. Back in the 19th century, the idea of votes for women, are you crazy? The little darlings? They haven't got the intellectual apparatus. How could you possibly let them vote? Now there's only a few parts of the world in which, in Europe, can you imagine anybody saying women shouldn't have votes? The whole mental fabric that we have has changed with that, as with slavery. I think it's a slow process, but we've got to see this with ending poverty. We need to align the MDGs to other global goals, particularly climate justice. How do we get climate justice? How do we stop the world from melting down and stop it from impoverishing people? We need to push for national plans to be linked to the MDGs, and particularly for those of us involved in these debates, we need to strategize, particularly next year, 2010, when the full review occurs, and then 2015. Do we reinvent the MDGs, or do we go to something different? Do we go back to human rights? Do we change the idea? Do we change the format? Is that what we're going to need to advance this idea that extreme poverty is morally unacceptable in an affluent world? Thank you.